Hi, this short lecture is an overview of Chapter 1 in your Thompson History of South Africa. This is the chapter entitled The Africans. Now, South Africa is an area that has a very, very, very long history of human and pre-human habitation. Uh, Really, the earliest known hominids um, have been found in South Africa, going all the way back to Australopithecus, and also some of the earliest remains of our species, Homo sapiens, have been found in the far south region of South Africa. Fossils 200,000 years old. The book mentions fossils 50,000 years old, but in fact, there have been 200,000-year-old fossils found in caves on the Indian Ocean. And so human beings have been in South Africa, literally as long as they've been on literally as long as we've been on any place on Earth. Now, one of the interesting things about South Africa, something that really is an indication of how old the human presence is in South Africa, are the click languages. Now, actually, that's one of the things I'm going to give you a link to today are some films on click languages. Now, linguists say that one of the indications of how old a language is how many consonants are in a language. And what we see is that the languages in Southern Africa, what nowadays is South Africa and Namibia and Botswana, those languages have an incredible number of consonants. And in particular, they have a lot of consonants with click, that have click sounds, like ka, 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 ung, tra, tra. You know, I'm saying them poorly, but those languages have a lot of sounds like that. And genetically, uh, it appears that people who look like the people, um, in particular in a little bit north of South Africa, particularly in Botswana, that those people have been in the area, going back, tens, maybe 100,000 years. Now, your book mentions a basic thing about Southern Africa, and that is that South Africa has a climate that gets drier as you go from east to west. The eastern part of South Africa, along the Indian Ocean, is wet and subtropical. It has about 49 inches of rain a year, which isn't, considering how much we've been getting over here lately, doesn't seem like a lot, but that's enough to be able to maintain tropical agriculture. I mean, if you go to modern day KwaZulu Natal, you'll see sugarcane fields, you'll see orange groves, um, you'll see a lot of, just, the kind of stuff that you could see growing in Florida or in California. Now, the further west you go, it gets drier. You know, um, Thompson mentions that, eventually you get to a point where you get less than 20 inches of rain a year. And once you get past that point, it really becomes difficult to have regular agriculture. Now, the other thing Thompson mentions too is that South Africa is prone to droughts, that, fairly regularly, South Africa gets pretty nasty droughts. And so, what this meant is that, in the last 1,500 or so years, um, especially in the period before Europeans came to South Africa, it was pretty much divided. You had the indigenous population, the aboriginal population, the oldest population lived further to the west. In particular, you had the hunter-gatherer people, and these are the people, like the Kung Bushmen, who were mentioned in chapter one. And they now the Bushmen. I really, like I say, that's probably, I shouldn't have used that term. These are the uh, hunter-gatherer populations nowadays. Um, the San, yeah, that's the proper term, the San. Um, you really don't have very many San in South Africa proper anymore. Um, San populations are much larger in Botswana. Um, as Thompson mentions, San populations were eventually forced out of South Africa by the end of the 19th century. You also had San populations in Zimbabwe, but they pretty much were forced out too. So nowadays, you pretty much see the San in Botswana uh, and Namibia. Now, these folks were hunter-gatherers, and like Thompson mentions, uh, they were very mobile. They had a lifestyle that didn't require a lot of property, and they were very mobile. But as he mentioned, the flip side of this was that if you couldn't keep up, in other words, if you weren't able to keep walking with the group and that kind of thing, when you got old, you simply were left behind, and they left you there to die because you could not keep up with them anymore. Now, what we see in southern Africa is that gradually the north influences the south. We see things coming down from the north to the south. And in particular, we see livestock coming down from the north. Khoi and San people, the San people come in contact with people further from the north who are raising livestock. And they get the livestock, and eventually the livestock are brought down into what nowadays is South Africa. Now, the Khoi and the San people are genetically pretty much the same people, but the Khoi people raise livestock. And because they raise livestock, they have a more secure access to food, and they grow bigger. And so therefore, these people are taller, stronger, a little bit more heavily built than the San people, who tend to be very small and very thin. Because frankly, if you spend a lifetime, tracking animals all day long, that doesn't lend itself to people being very big. Now, to kind of make a connection with the book that I have you all reading about, Sarah Bartmann, the lady who's also known as Hottentot Venus. Now, her background is Khoi. She comes from an Aboriginal community that had adopted animal husbandry, and lived in that area that was kind of on the border between Bantu-speaking peoples and the Khoisan people. And that's one reason why she was built the way she was. Because if you all have been reading the book, a great deal was made about her physique, but she had a more substantial physique because she came from Khoisan background, and she was getting a lot of good protein from milk products on a regular basis, and so that's why she was larger. Now, the thing to understand about South Africa today is that the majority of people in South Africa today are not the Khoisan people who live in the western part of South Africa primarily. Um, and like I said, you really don't have that many people who would be pure Khoisan in South Africa anymore at all, really, because of European colonization. A lot of these people nowadays are mixed race or colored people, and so you have people who are part Khoisan and part European, and then also, as Thompson mentions, many Khoisan people were absorbed into Bantu speaking communities. And so you have a lot of people, like, you look at, most famous example I can think of is Nelson Mandela. If you look at his face, you can obviously see that he had Khoi ancestry. If you look at the shape of his eyes, the shape of his face, he has a very Khoi looking face. And so what we see is that nowadays, Khoi populations, Khoi sand populations, you don't see them uh, in their original form very often in South Africa. Most of them have been absorbed either into the mixed race communities, where they have that separate identity as mixed race people or colored people. And then you also see people who identify themselves as, say, a Bantu speaking language group like Xhosa or Zulu or Swana. Um, but if you look at them, they obviously, have the Khoi background. Now, the significant thing about Bantu speaking people when they came down into South Africa, they had a couple of advantages. Now, first of all, they practiced agriculture. And agriculture, as Thompson said, could be successfully practiced in the eastern part of South Africa, where there was sufficient rainfall to support agriculture. Excuse me. And the other great advantage that Bantu speaking people had was that they knew how to smelt iron. Now, one of the interesting things that we've really found out over the last 60 years or so is that it appears that Africa is actually the place where people first learned how to make iron, where people first learned how to smelt iron and create iron tools. For many years, people thought that iron was first smelted in what nowadays is Turkey, the Hittites. But over time, research has been done, and it's been found that the earliest iron sites actually come out of what nowadays is the Sahara region of Africa. Because you have to understand, several thousand years ago, much of what nowadays is desert was grassland, had a fair amount of water, actually a fair amount of trees. One of the great ironies of iron production is that you need charcoal to produce iron. And in places like Kush, for instance, if you go to ancient Kush and what nowadays is Sudan, you can see where, forests were chopped down in order to produce iron. And so, the iron technology had the downside of negatively impacting the Sahara's ecology. And, that's the nature of technology in general. Quite often technology has unintended consequences that aren't good for the environment. And so, the African experience is really not different from anybody else's. But to get back to the main point, iron was a big difference maker because iron tools were more efficient. They made for better, better digging tools. I mean, obviously, if you're going to cut down a tree, it's better to have an iron axe or an iron machete than a sharp rock. You're going to cut a tree down more efficiently with that. And then, of course, the iron tools, iron technology also was quite useful for weapons. And so this gave Bantu speakers a huge advantage. And, iron technology, along with the fact that they were agricultural practitioners, eventually gave them a huge population advantage. And, that's why nowadays about 80% of the population in South Africa are people who have, come from Bantu language backgrounds. Now, the other thing that Thompson mentions in chapter 1 is that, because these societies were not literate societies, these were not societies where people kept written records, we have to kind of make generalizations about the period of history before Europeans showed up. Because, once Europeans showed up, these folks wrote and they left written records, and They interviewed people and gave information. But prior to that, really, archaeology is the most effective way. Basically looking at, remains. Like, for instance, you can go to the northern part of South Africa, like the northern border of South Africa, especially the northeastern border, is the Limpopo River, which is the boundary between South Africa and Zimbabwe. If you go up into that area, you can find where people were, had kilns and foundries making iron, over 1,000 years ago. Some of the people were actually able to produce steel. And so what we see is that, this technological advantage that the Bantu had eventually allowed them to become the dominant African population in what would become South Africa. And it's really interesting because, one of the interesting things, about South Africa, and this is something we'll see more when we get into the chapter dealing with Europeans, is that Europeans, one of the reasons why they were successful in South Africa is that when they first came to South Africa, they came to the Western Cape, which was an area where you don't have Bantu-speaking Africans. It's very thinly populated, and it has, Mediterranean-style climate, and they were able to start growing stuff there and to establish themselves really before they had to have significant contact with the much more densely populated Bantu-speaking societies, which gave them a leg up once they came into contact with them. But I'm not going to get into that too much now because we're going to talk about that more when we talk about chapter 2. And that's something I plan to do. I'll probably record that on Friday. Anyway, I hope this helps you out. If you have any questions, contact me.